December 1945, Bavaria, southern Germany. Snow drifts quietly over the ruins of a once proud town. Beyond the barbed wire of a U.S. prisoner of war camp, a group of German women huddled together in worn military coats. They had been clerks, nurses, radio operators, now simply prisoners, silent and shivering. For months they had lived under the weight of defeat, expecting punishment, humiliation, perhaps worse. That night, the camp lights flickered, and something unfamiliar began to glow beyond the guard towers. Strings of tiny bulbs, hanging from wooden poles, twinkling softly against the snow. It was Christmas. The women froze. Some covered their faces. Others stared in disbelief. No one had expected this. Not from the victors. Not from the enemy. And as the lights shimmered through the cold Bavarian night, the sound of muffled sobs filled the silence. Because for the first time, they felt safe. In the final months of 1945, southern Germany lay in ruins. Cities had burned, families had vanished, and the war that promised glory had left only hunger, shame, and disbelief. The German surrender had come swiftly, but for many who had served the Reich, even in clerical or auxiliary roles, the fear had only just begun. Among the defeated were thousands of young women who had worked for the German military. They had served as secretaries, nurses, and communication aides, following orders, many scarcely understanding the vast machinery of destruction they had helped sustain. When captured by advancing American forces, they were marched to holding camps scattered across Bavaria, surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and an unspoken terror of what awaited them. They had heard stories, rumors that the Allies would take revenge, that women in uniform would be executed, humiliated, or sent to the Soviet camps where few ever returned. The air in the camp was thick with fear and resignation. Even as days passed without violence, the silence of the guards, the strange politeness of the American soldiers, confused them more than it comforted them. They waited for cruelty that never came. It was in this fragile stillness, between fear and the faint hope of survival, that an unexpected moment would unfold, a moment of simple light and human warmth that would shatter months of dread. That moment would come on a December night, when the Americans decided to hang Christmas lights along the fences of the camp. To the German women inside, it was not decoration. It was deliverance. The soft glow of compassion would soon replace the shadows of fear. And that is where their story truly begins. By the end of 1945, Germany was no longer a nation. It was a ruin. The Third Reich had collapsed in flames, its cities reduced to skeletal remains of stone and steel. The Allies now occupied every corner of the country, dividing it into zones of control. In the south, the U.S. Army governed Bavaria and parts of Württemberg, establishing hundreds of makeshift camps to contain millions of surrendered soldiers and auxiliaries. Among these prisoners were thousands of women who had served the Nazi state in uniform. Most were members of the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht clerical staff, or the female signals corps known as Nachrichtenhelferinnen. Many were in their late teens or early 20s. Their service had rarely involved combat, yet guilt and suspicion followed them. The uniform alone was enough to mark them as the enemy. Life in post-war Germany was desperate. Food was scarce, infrastructure shattered, and disease spread through the displaced populations. But for prisoners, especially women, there was an added weight: the fear of retribution. Soviet captivity was widely dreaded, and stories of assaults and forced marches reached even the most isolated camps. By contrast, the Americans were strict but disciplined. Still, German propaganda had long portrayed them as brutal occupiers, intent on destroying every trace of German pride. So when these women found themselves behind American wire, they expected hunger, humiliation, and punishment. What they encountered instead was structure, silence, and order. Their captors seemed almost indifferent, neither cruel nor kind, merely efficient. Yet beneath that surface calm, an unseen transformation was building. For the women who survived those first uncertain weeks, the smallest human gestures, a smile, a warm drink, a shared word, began to challenge everything they had been taught. And soon, that challenge would become undeniable. The journey to captivity began in silence. Columns of German women, exhausted and hollow-eyed, trudged through the snow-covered countryside of Bavaria. Their boots were torn, their uniforms ill-fitting, and their breaths came out in pale clouds that vanished into the frozen air. American trucks rumbled slowly beside them, engines humming, soldiers watchful but calm. They passed through villages where buildings stood gutted and scorched. Windows were shattered, church steeples broken, and once proud flags of the Reich lay trampled in the mud. Every sound, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant bark of orders, felt magnified against the stillness of defeat. Some women clutched small parcels or photographs, remnants of a life now gone. Others simply walked, heads bowed, whispering prayers no one could hear. When they reached the camp, they saw rows of wooden barracks, fenced in by barbed wire that glittered faintly with frost. Watchtowers loomed at the corners, manned by soldiers in thick winter coats. Floodlights cast long shadows across the compound, cold and unblinking. To the women, it looked like the end, a place where fear would finally take shape. The gates opened with a metallic groan. Orders were brief, translated into broken German. Move here, stand there, leave belongings. The guards did not shout. They did not strike. Their restraint was almost unsettling. The women obeyed, trembling, expecting the cruelty that never came. Inside the barracks, straw mattresses were lined against the walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, disinfectant, and faint traces of coffee. It was not comfort, but it was not the horror they had imagined either. As night fell, the sound of distant music drifted faintly from the American quarters, a radio playing a slow, unfamiliar tune. The women listened in silence, unsure whether it was meant for them or despite them. But it marked something new, the first night of captivity that did not bring terror, but uneasy wonder. Morning came with the sound of boots crunching on frozen ground. The women stirred from restless sleep as the door to the barracks opened. A group of American soldiers stood outside. Young men in thick wool coats, faces pale from the cold, helmets dusted with frost. They did not raise their weapons. One of them spoke softly, motioning for the women to come forward in small groups. At first, no one moved. Fear kept them rooted. Then, hesitantly, a few stepped forward, hands clasped tightly, eyes lowered. They were led to a table where U.S. medics waited with clipboards and tin cups of water. The medics spoke with patient, measured voices, taking down names, checking for injuries, offering bandages and food. It felt impossible. These were the men they had been told would destroy them, the barbarians from propaganda posters. Yet here they were, calm, methodical, even kind. One woman, her arm wrapped in a torn bandage, watched as an American sergeant carefully cleaned her wound and replaced the dressing. He said nothing harsh, only nodded once before handing her a small piece of bread. She froze, staring at the food, unable to speak. Then she whispered a quiet, "Danke." The sergeant simply tipped his cap and moved to the next prisoner. Later that day, more soldiers appeared with steaming buckets of soup. They poured portions into tin bowls, making sure each woman received one. The warmth of the broth, the smell of vegetables and meat, drew silent tears from many who had eaten little more than stale crusts for weeks. By nightfall, fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. The women no longer waited for punishment. They waited for understanding. Something within them began to shift, slowly and silently, like ice beginning to thaw. Days passed, and what began as cautious disbelief turned into quiet astonishment. Each morning, guards opened the barrack doors and handed out breakfast: hot porridge, dark bread, sometimes even a sliver of butter. It was more than most had eaten in months. The women ate in silence, afraid to appear ungrateful, yet unable to hide the tears that came when the warmth reached their stomachs. Soon after, a medic unit arrived. They brought soap, bandages, and clean clothing stripped of military insignia. The women were told to wash, to rest, and to recover. Many had expected interrogation or humiliation. Instead, they found buckets of warm water and bars of American soap that smelled faintly of lavender. For the first time since the war had ended, they saw their reflections, pale, sunken, but alive. One prisoner, a former nurse from Munich, later wrote that the moment she received a clean blanket, she cried for the first time since her capture. It was, she said, the smallest act of mercy, and it broke me completely. Around the camp, small changes began to appear. The barracks were repaired. Fires were allowed to burn longer. Letters were collected for Red Cross delivery. These gestures, so ordinary to the soldiers, felt extraordinary to those who had lived in fear. It was a quiet revolution, not fought with weapons, but with decency and with every kind gesture. The walls of propaganda that had imprisoned their minds began to crumble. The women no longer saw faceless enemies in uniform. They began to see men, tired, respectful, and capable of kindness, and that realization marked the beginning of a fragile, human peace that no surrender document could ever write. By late autumn, the rhythm of life inside the camp had settled into a quiet routine. The fear that had once ruled every breath began to fade, replaced by something almost unfamiliar: calm. Each morning, a whistle signaled the start of the day. The women lined up for roll call, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The American guards moved down the rows, counting with efficiency but not hostility. When it ended, the prisoners dispersed, some to the kitchen tents to peel potatoes, others to laundry duty, sewing rooms, or small cleaning teams that kept the camp running. Work was steady but humane. There were no beatings, no shouting. The rules were strict, but the tone was different. A discipline that carried dignity rather than fear. After the morning labor, the women returned to the mess hall where a long wooden table waited. Meals were modest: cabbage soup, bread, sometimes bits of canned meat. Yet, to those who had starved through the final months of war, it was a feast. On cold afternoons, some soldiers would share stories, showing photographs of families back home. The women listened cautiously, intrigued by the ordinariness of the men they had once imagined as monsters. In return, they sometimes spoke of their own families, of mothers waiting in ruined cities, of brothers still missing in the East. The camp also began hosting short lessons. A German-speaking American chaplain organized small gatherings where prisoners could read or write letters. Others taught simple English phrases. Slowly, the sound of laughter, hesitant at first, began to echo across the courtyard. At night, lanterns glowed softly inside the barracks. The women whispered to one another, speaking not of fear, but of what might come after this captivity, of homes, peace, and the uncertain shape of the future. For the first time, they slept, without expecting footsteps of violence outside their doors. But as December approached, something new stirred among the guards. Quiet preparations, small hints of celebration, and none of the prisoners could have imagined what those preparations were leading toward. Among the hundreds of women held in the camp, a few stood out, not for rank or distinction, but for the quiet ways their lives began to change. Helga was 21, a former Luftwaffe radio operator from Dresden. She had survived the firebombing of her city, only to be captured near Augsburg weeks later. In the first days of captivity, she had refused to speak to any guard, convinced that showing weakness would invite punishment. But one morning, when an American soldier offered her a wool scarf against the cold, she hesitated, then accepted. She later admitted that simple act left her trembling for hours. "It was the first time," she wrote in a post-war diary, "that I felt warmth not from fire, but from another human being." Then there was Greta, a clerk who had copied army files until the last day of the war. She carried guilt like a shadow, believing that every sheet of paper she typed had helped prolong the bloodshed. One evening, as she scrubbed dishes, beside an American cook, she asked in broken English, "Why are you kind to us?" The cook paused, then replied gently, "War is over, ma'am." She said nothing more, but that phrase echoed inside Greta's heart for years afterward, and Marta, once a nurse in a field hospital near Munich, found herself tending to both German and American patients within the camp infirmary. It was there she realized the sameness of pain, the identical groans of wounded men, no matter which uniform they had worn. "Suffering," she wrote, "has no flag." Their stories were fragments of a greater truth emerging within those fences, that humanity could outlive hatred, even in the ruins of war. Yet none of them could have foreseen that the most profound moment of their captivity was still to come. A night when light itself would make them weep. As winter deepened, small acts of kindness began to spread through the camp like faint warmth from a dying fire. Gentle, almost invisible, yet powerful enough to change everything. The American soldiers, many of them barely older than the prisoners, began leaving small gifts at the edge of the barracks. Chocolate bars, biscuits, sometimes even cigarettes wrapped in paper with the word peace scrawled in German. No orders had been given for such gestures. They came naturally, born from shared fatigue and quiet empathy. On Sundays, a chaplain arrived with a portable organ. He played hymns that drifted through the camp, melodies the German women recognized from their own childhood churches. For a few minutes, the sound erased the barbed wire, the uniforms, the labels of victor and defeated. Women stood silently, eyes closed, lips moving to familiar words. The soldiers also arranged for small parcels from the Red Cross: soap, postcards, and bits of cloth to mend torn clothing. One evening, A guard noticed a prisoner stitching a doll out of scraps of fabric. When asked, she explained it was for her daughter, waiting somewhere in a refugee camp. The next day, she found a bundle of wool thread and needles left discreetly at the door. Each of these gestures pierced the heavy fog of guilt and fear that hung over the camp. And then came December, the month no one expected to feel like anything but sorrow. The Americans began gathering wood, hammering planks, stringing wires along the fences. The women watched in silence, uncertain what the construction meant. They had no idea that these men, once their enemies, were building something that would reach deeper than any weapon ever could. A simple gift of light. It happened on a cold evening in late December. The air was still, the sky heavy with snow, and the camp lay cloaked in silence. The women sat huddled inside the barracks, their breaths visible in the pale glow of kerosene lamps. Then, somewhere beyond the fence, a faint click echoed. A sound so small it might have been missed. Moments later, the darkness shifted.
Across the yard, strings of tiny bulbs flickered to life, yellow, red, green, and white. They stretched from post to post, tracing the outline of the camp. The light reflected off the snow, soft and shimmering, casting long, golden halos against the wire. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the realization spread. It was Christmas. The American soldiers stood quietly near the gates, watching. One of them carried a small portable speaker, and from it came the gentle chords of a carol, Silent Night. The melody floated across the frozen air, fragile and pure. Inside the barracks, the women stared through the slats in stunned silence. For months, they had lived convinced that the world had forgotten them, that the enemy hated them beyond redemption. Yet here, in the place built to contain their defeat, the enemy had given them light. One woman covered her mouth as tears began to fall. Another knelt by the window, whispering the words of the song in German, Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Soon, others joined, voices trembling, blending faintly with the American tune beyond the wire. No speeches were made. No orders were given. Only light and song, a shared moment between those who had once faced each other across battlefields. That night, the guards did not patrol. The women did not sleep. They simply watched the lights, as if afraid to blink and lose them. And for the first time since the war had ended, they wept, not from fear, but from something they thought they would never feel again. Hope. In the days that followed, the Christmas lights remained, glowing softly each evening, long after the snow had covered the wires. To the American soldiers, they were just decoration, a reminder of home. But to the German women inside the camp, those lights became something sacred, proof that mercy could exist even after such a war. Many had entered captivity believing that compassion was weakness, that enemies could not be human. Now they saw the opposite. The same men they had feared showed them dignity instead of vengeance. It unsettled them at first, this quiet kindness that made no demands, offered no judgment. But soon it began to take root, breaking apart the hardened layers of hatred planted by years of propaganda. One woman later wrote in her diary, "The Americans did not preach to us. They showed us." And that was stronger than any words. As the days passed, the women began speaking openly about the lies they had believed, how fear had been used to divide them, how obedience had blinded them. They did not absolve themselves of guilt, but they began to understand that forgiveness, too, was a form of courage. For the soldiers, it was a lesson as well. They had seen the enemy up close, not as soldiers on a battlefield, but as young women shivering in the cold, clinging to fragments of dignity. And they realized that the victory they carried meant nothing if it was not accompanied by compassion. The barbed wire still stood. The war was not forgotten. But something within those fences had changed, a small reconciliation of hearts that no treaty could ever record. That change quietly prepared them all for what was to come next. As the winter snow began to thaw, life inside the camp moved toward a fragile normalcy. The war was over, but its echoes still lingered in every look, every silence, every memory that refused to fade. Yet among the women, something new had taken root, a quiet rhythm of survival that felt almost like peace. Each morning, the camp awoke to the familiar clang of the mess bell. There were chores to do, lessons to attend, and letters to write. Some women worked in the camp kitchen, learning to bake bread with American flour. Others tended the small garden near the fence, planting potatoes and frozen soil, as if to prove that life could grow again even on the ashes of defeat. The guards, once distant, now greeted them with nods or short words in broken German. A few women had even learned to answer in English, hesitant phrases of gratitude or curiosity. Good morning. Thank you. Lights, very beautiful. Simple words that carried the weight of reconciliation. A Red Cross representative visited weekly, collecting names for family tracing. Slowly, news trickled in: a mother found in Hamburg, a brother returning from Italy, a city rebuilt from rubble. Hope no longer came from propaganda or orders, but from letters written in trembling hands. The Americans began dismantling parts of the camp fence, section by section. It was a small act of trust, one that made the women stand silently, unsure whether to smile or cry. They had entered those fences as prisoners of fear. Now, many of them no longer felt like prisoners at all. For they had already stepped into a new kind of freedom, one defined not by borders or flags, but by understanding. By the spring of 1946, the orders came quietly: the camp would close, and the women would be released in small groups. Their names were read out one by one, followed by destinations: Munich, Nuremberg, Stuttgart. Many had no homes left to return to, only ruins or distant relatives scattered across the zones of occupation. Yet as they stepped beyond the gates, each carried something unseen: the memory of that winter, of the night when light had melted fear. Some wrote years later about that moment. Others never spoke of it again. But all remembered the faces of the American soldiers who had treated them not as enemies, but as people. It was a kind of mercy they could neither explain nor forget. Helga, the radio operator, settled in Cologne and became a teacher. She would tell her students that forgiveness was not weakness, it was proof of humanity. Marta returned to nursing, tending to children born into the hunger of post-war Germany. Greta eventually emigrated to Canada, where she sent money every Christmas to veterans' hospitals in the United States. None of them ever forgot that first Christmas light. For the soldiers, too, the memory lingered. Some would later write home that the quiet gratitude of those women changed how they saw victory. That it reminded them the true end of war was not the surrender of armies, but the healing of hearts. The lights that once glowed behind barbed wire became symbols of something greater, not celebration, but compassion. And in that frozen Bavarian winter, among ruins and sorrow, humanity had quietly reclaimed its place. Because even after the darkest war in history, one small act of kindness could still make the world shine again.